workshop, for which I'm very grateful. I would like to just start by saying that we're all here to share and learn from each other. And in doing so, we would like to record this session so we can share and make this learning and collective learning more shareable and more collective. So I would just like to let everyone know that. And if at any point we have, well, actually at the end, we usually have a Q&A. And at that point, we usually stop recording. So we will have time when we can actually speak in a room without a Zoom room without being recorded towards the end. But I've structured this workshop as an introductory workshop in many ways to make it more accessible. And I would invite scholars, researchers, folks here who have practiced interviewing in race and research more than others to give us their learnings as we go along through this workshop. So Jan, would you please go to the next slide?
So as Sadhvi has shared with us, there will be a Q&A session. Shirley would have introduced Sadhvi and described the format of our today's event, and unfortunately, there is some technical issues that's preventing her from joining with us at this point. So the Q&A will start after Sadhvi's presentation, and if you have any questions during that time, please type out the questions in the chat, and during the presentation itself, the mics will be muted. And once again, just remind us all that this is being recorded and it will be shared on our YouTube channels. Sadhvi, would you like me to introduce your briefly, or?
Oh, yeah, sure. I can do it myself if you like. Um, yeah, sure. That's cool. I'm Sadhvi Dar, as I said. I'm a reader in interdisciplinary management and organization studies. And that part of interdisciplinarity is very important to me, partly because I feel that there is some richness and also humility and understanding that not one discipline can capture the richness of other disciplines. And there's something to be said about creating dialogue amongst scholars from different backgrounds and interests. And that's something that I like to do in my research. And it's how I found this rather long pathway and journey into decolonial feminist work and Black studies, Black liberation thought, and critical race studies. And those are the sorts of things that will be shaping our workshop today. But I just wanted to say before I kick off that you can stay in touch with us in a number of ways, and I hope this has come out okay. I've just popped a few links in the chat, which will link to our Borderlines LinkedIn page. As we said, everything's being recorded, and we are putting it on an Anti-Racist Lab collab with Borderlines YouTube playlist, and the link is up there for that playlist. So please do have a look and subscribe. And I'm not on social media very much, but I do tend to use LinkedIn. So if you would like to give me a follow and connect there, then I'm really happy to do that. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you, Jan. You're carrying quite a lot in this session, so I really appreciate you helping me with the slides today. This is just a really brief sort of outline of what to expect today. We've had our opening and our introduction, and there is now two sections before we come to the closing discussion, which is an open Q&A. The first is more of a kind of grounding section, if you like. which we will share how research is a site of struggle, and what that means for folks doing for researching race. And I will give you a very brief overview of decolonial feminist approaches to knowledge making. We could, of course, spend a whole day together talking about these things. So I apologize for the brevity of these sections. And then we're going to have an activity where we're going to sort of bring to bear our own positionality, and to reflect on that, and how it might shape our relationship to research broadly, but also to interviewing particularly. And then we'll come to the more sort of core content, where I'll be looking at power dynamics in interview settings. As promised, I'll be setting out 3 types of interviews: the semi-structured interview, which is very common, very well used in a lot of qualitative research, ethnographic approaches, and unstructured or narrative approaches. And we'll talk about how when researchers may want to use these different kinds of approaches to interviewing. And then we're going to finish with a summary, I suppose, of looking at how race embodiment and interview dynamics interrelate with each other. And we're going to have another short activity to do where we might get you into breakout groups. I don't know how you feel about that, but I think it'd be nice to maybe have a conversation in a smaller group together, to revise some interview questions from traditional through to questions that reflect decolonial feminist orientations. And then we'll have our closing discussion. Thank you so much, Jan. Please, can we go to the next slide? I start with the words of Linda Tawi Smith, an Indigenous researcher who is oft cited when we begin our journeys and our learning on decolonial methodologies and research. And what I would like to ground ourselves by is the the idea that research is a site of struggle rather than an objective or neutral pursuit of knowledge production. And what Smith enables us to reflect on is to look at the history of research as tied to the Enlightenment movement, which was shaping European ideas of racial superiority, and also empiricism as the tool of creating categories and hierarchies of racial, gendered, sexual hierarchies. And by drawing our attention to this, Smith is asking us to look at the claim of objectification in research as a suspicious claim. That we should interrogate the claim of objectivity, because research has historically used objectification as a process to dehumanize categories of human and to strip the category of human from racialized through racialized schemas. And at the same time, she invites us to not only understand the tools of research, such as interviewing, but also to think about the conceptual tools that underpin these methods, and that those conceptual ideas can often feel uncomfortable to engage with, because very often they reveal the shaky grounds on which so many truth claims are made. Just want to give a heads up to Shirley, who's just joined. Good to see you there, Shirley. Thank you, Jan. Can we go to the next slide, please? So maybe to break down some of the components of decolonial feminist approaches, which Linda Dowie Smith is drawing on and contributing to. When we're conducting interviews, we're doing so to make knowledge. And what we should do, I'm inviting us, what we should do is perhaps look at how that knowledge making in an interview process is underscored by some of these conceptual and critical issues that can help us become more reflexive of our own approach, our own power in that dynamic and in that process. The first idea, I think, that I've been very shaped by and influenced by is the idea of not knowing as being an important idea motivating our research. And what I mean by that is not to go out and explore and take and extract to relieve that not knowing, but to work with the limits of not knowing so we prevent ourselves from making universal claims. And therefore, we're recognizing knowledge as something situated, partial, rather than universal. And this speaks to an idea of the pluriversal. This is an idea that the decolonial mobilizes. And again, the pluriversal has sometimes been talked about as a kind of comparative or sort of relative social construction of different ways of knowing. But there is perhaps a more radical way of understanding the pluriversal, which is to understand the coexistence of entire knowledge systems, where some of these are hidden, some of these become erased, some of these are removed because of research and empiricism's need and thrust to create categories of hierarchy. And so the pluriversal is actually prompting us to center and to shape our research pursuits around not only issues of doing no harm, but also of preserving an idea of humanity where my humanity does not rest on someone's humanities being erased. And this speaks very explicitly to the way that the need for decolonial work, the premise of Black studies has been to engage with those knowledges and those communities, those historically excluded from knowledge-making processes. What that also can mean is that we're not talking about knowledge just as written text or as authoritative, but also as embodied, that the body is a site of knowledge making and validation. And therefore, if we start to look at the body as a source of knowledge making, then it comes to our attention here that books will tell us only so much. There are things that we feel, that we are affected by. There are also spiritual and sacred ways of knowing, which, if we remove those categories of authority, we can begin to coexist with these categories of knowing. And the work of M. Jackie Alexander in the book Pedagogies of Crossing has a really lovely chapter right towards the end. I think it's chapter 7, where she talks about pedagogies of the sacred, where this distinction between the cognitive neuropsychology part of knowing cannot be detracted from the spiritual and sacred part of ourselves, that actually both inform each other in meaningful ways. And so going into an interview situation, we need to keep those embodied elements of the interview experience alive and well, and honor those in our interviews with the communities and the folks that we're working with. So I'm bringing up a lot of stuff about history, about the sacred, about embodiment. And in a way, I think that journey to accessing those things can become easier, if you like, by centering reflexivity, centering self-investigation. That is to understand how the power is working through our bodies, how our positionality and location, social location, is also operationalizing an access to certain knowledge, an ignorance around certain things, and a healthy not knowing, where our curiosity can be one to get to know, but also not knowing should not get in the way of being solidaristic with communities, right? So the reflexivity component, the self-investigation, is an integral part of creating knowledge that has the capacity and potential to challenge colonial structures. And those last 2 points there, I want to emphasize relationality is a very important component of decolonial and indigenizing research. And here, this is, I think, something that goes to the heart of, again, the Enlightenment project, which is to separate the human from the environment. And instead, relationality emphasizes the relationship as knowledge itself. And therefore, thereby, what we're interested in doing is to understand the more collective processes of knowledge making and to understand the interdependence of humans in their environment and amongst different species, be they sacred, be they biological. And lastly, there is a politics to doing this kind of work. And there is a imperative to commit to research that has the capacity to change thinking, to make changes, to make actionable the sort of transformations that we need for collective liberation. And that sounds like a really big ask of research and of a researcher. But to understand this as a community which has a long history, and that this work has been done through the very first encounter between the colonizer and the colonized. We can see this as part of a broader movement of knowledge making that we are a very small component, but important component of. Thank you so much, Jan. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you so much. So I want to just bring some of that conceptualizing to the interview setting itself, which is very often one-to-one, and therefore there is some sort of interpersonal dynamic there that we need to pay attention to, and how that interpersonal has also structural dimensions of racial socialization embedded within it. And I want to pay attention a little bit to Frantz Fanon's work, which, as some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Fanon's work, trained as a psychiatrist and built theories of anti-colonial movement making based on a lot of his clinical practice that looked at the internalization of racist categories of superiority, looked at how Black inferiority becomes internalized and leads to alienation, and also how whiteness is imbibed by white people to dehumanize themselves. That is, to strip away that capacity to relate to each other, to all humans, in ways that value each other and see each other as human. So when we bring this to the interview setting, we can see how these legacies and ongoing neocolonialism has the potential, but also is operationalized to racialize a person's body schema. And therefore, when we are doing research on race, our interactions with those folks will also speak to interactions with the broader world around us, in which our racial identity can lead to feelings of self-doubt and alienation, and these can bring up discomfort, but also damaging dynamics in the interview process. At the same time, I also am struck by the work of the Chicana feminists, and Sherry Moraga being a key proponent of that intellectual tradition, that activist tradition. And this is a poem, an excerpt from a poem of hers that she's written, and I'll just read it for you, where she says, "I lack imagination, you say. No, I lack language. The language to clarify my resistance to the literate. Words are a war to me. They threaten my family." I find this excerpt of this poem very instructive in understanding how the negotiation of words and language in the interview setting speak much more deeply than what's just being said in the room. They are very often for the participant in that interview a negotiation, a process of struggle where there is often a balancing act going on between what is shared and what is not shared, and how even making certain knowledge available, literate, spoken, can actually damage or prevent or mitigate the ways of life that preserve racialized communities. So survival strategies, talking about racial violence, discrimination in the interview setting can be a negotiation that is never spoken in the interview setting, but is one that we need to be aware of. Thank you, Jan. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so now I'm going to bring this much more uncritically, if you like, to the interview setting. So I've kind of been hinting at a few things here, but I want to just reiterate them and using some of these conceptual tools to do so. So one thing that we've been talking about is racial identity, but also how this is embodied. Fanon calls this an epidemization praxis, which where he's talking about how our bodies are already socialized into racial categories before we meet, before we speak. And so that socialization, if you like, precedes any verbal exchange, and we are reading each other through these socially constructed racial categories. And that's going to impact how we are perceived, but also how we respond to each other and what is said and what is heard. We've also talked about embodiment, and here in the interview setting, these can be invoked to create an affinity, a likeness, a kind of accountability to each other in that interview setting, but they can also be mobilizing the withholding of information, or what we called code switching, right? So when we change our vernacular, our grammar, to accommodate what we think the other person wants to hear from us, or how we think that person will hear us if we code switch, right? So embodiment can come up in these ways in the interview setting. There are then obviously physical responses and gestures that a simple recording tool like a voice memo recording will not capture. And so those things where we're unconsciously, through gasps, through holding breath, through raising our chest, through the way how we're relaxed in our shoulders, in our neck, these cues to understanding where the other person is at in that interview are to be taken seriously. And I'm also reminded of Shirley Ann Tate's work on Black Beauty Shame, where Shirley mobilizes a way of analysis where these physical attributes and the sort of orality as it comes out and is spoken and brought into the world is taken seriously in the transcription and also in the analysis. And lastly, I mean, this is why I think reflexivity and creating these kind of spaces where we can talk about these things is really important, because researcher discomfort is a very real thing where we may encounter a dynamic, we might receive information, we may receive knowledge which is triggering or is something that we feel uncomfortable dealing with. And so that can lead us as interviewers to avoid that or gloss over it or not take that seriously. So I think keeping ourselves accountable can at least help us revisit that discomfort and make it part of the research process rather than stripping it away and believing that we'll do this work without ever having any sort of uncomfortable moments in our research. Next slide, please, Jan. Okay, so you'll be happy to hear that we're 40 minutes in and this is a good time, a good moment for me to stop speaking for a while. And for us to do a little activity. I'm going to invite us actually to do this on our own and then use the chat to share. But if someone wants to raise their hand and speak, then that would be great. We've been talking a lot about positionality, about discomfort, researcher discomfort, and how having these conversations and really exercising that muscle of creating opportunities for self-reflection is an important starting point when we're doing this work. So I'm going to invite you to do a little exercise for 10 minutes. So it's 40 minutes past the hour here. So till 50 minutes past the hour, I would like you, and I invite you to create a map. I've got a piece of paper here in front of me, but you could do it, on a phone or your laptop. I just like scribbling on paper when I'm doing this kind of stuff. But to identify and begin to identify, because we won't get very far in 10 minutes, but to begin to identify some of your social locations. Something immediately that will come to mind is your academic discipline, right? But we can also go towards reflecting on our connection to land, including family migrations, also family removals. We can also think about the languages spoken around us that we speak, also languages forgotten, things that are not are contained in our body, but as something that is forgotten, and also our gendered and racialized identities. And on our racialized identities, I'd invite you to think about fragile those are, how we can be one race in one context and a different race in a different geography and context, and to reflect on that a little bit. And as you're doing that, as you're mapping these positionalities, these locations, please think about how those locations might influence you when you're in a research context. What can you see? What can you connect to? And what can't be seen? What might be an area of not knowing in your interview practice? So we'll just, I'll mute myself and I'll also do this exercise along with you. So let's give ourselves like 8 minutes, shall we say? And then we can have like a 2-minute little sort of feedback session. So I'll just mute myself now and let's just give ourselves a bit of time to do this activity. Just got another 3 minutes. Do you think you'll be ready to share in a minute or so? can give a thumbs up or put in the chat if you need a bit more time. Okay, let's bring it back to a sharing. How did you find that that process, that activity? You can use the chat if you wish to. I became very aware of how my sort of loss of, you know, wanting to become an artist was very much associated with kinship expectations and parental expectations, but how it's kind of come back in other ways. And then how I moved to psychology as a way of negotiating that that refusal of going into art. But also it kind of brought me closer to whiteness and to ideas of academic excellence, how they became fused with whiteness. And that made me pursue a kind of mixed strategy, I think, of trying to unlearn, but also sort of perpetuate some of these things early on. Fatima's written something in the chat. Fatima, would you like to unmute yourself and maybe just speak to some of this?
Yeah, sure, why not?
Thank you.
Thanks for doing this activity. It has been very meaningful and really make me aware of certain things. Just like I have mentioned in my comment, my family background is more like a very common dish that you put all of the ingredients into. So I'm born in Bangladesh. My mom is from India. My dad was born in Bangladesh, and both of their parents were India, and they moved like 1,000 times from one place to another during the colonial period and after that. So in my family, we speak lots of languages, and then we don't speak a lot other. So it's like a mix of everything. And then I'm in my second year of PhD, and when I'm doing field work, I come across such people who also have like mixed background like mine. They do certain things, but they just don't know what meanings to put onto them. And sometimes I feel like the things that they are telling to me about their life, about their stories, I'm very biased. I'm putting my own meanings into it. But then I try to be, be a bit more critical to it. But I don't know if I'm doing enough or not. So it's like a never-ending battle.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really important reflection as you're starting this research and in a lot of ways doing doctoral work. I should say Fatima as a PhD student doing doctoral work is very often for a lot of us that first experience of doing a self-directed research project. And so within that, hearing for the first time and being in that research context, hearing those participants' voices, I think it's very helpful to keep accountable to folks around you, right? To share your initial reflections and then to um, um, be prompted and invited to reflect on how what was said we didn't receive, you know, the first time and how that reception changes over time. Thank you
Thank you,
for getting us
Sadhvi.
started. And Shirley said, I noticed that I miss being able to use my own language in interviews in the global north. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, Shirley?
I'm not sure because somebody else has put something about Spanish, so maybe I should give them space instead of me hugging it.
That's okay. That's okay. But both of you have talked about language. Myra has talked about like reflecting on the languages forgotten. For me, that's Spanish after becoming an academic in the UK, forced to write, publish in English. I think that's so right. I feel like I knew, like the first language I spoke was Hindi, and I felt like I knew that better 10 years ago than what I know now, because I feel my academic career, if you like, has stripped out the practice of that language from my everyday. So I'm grateful for that, for those reflections. Let's just let's move on, unless there is something that we want to bring up. Let's move on to the next slide. That's it. Thank you, Densua. Yes, thank you for bringing that to our attention, the insider-outsider experience. That's I think that's something that we need to, that tension is something that's very important to hold on to, certainly. So after that exercise, and forgive me for not prompting you more about that, maybe we can come back to that later in the Q&A, is, you know, from doing that exercise around self-reflection and thinking about how this is creating openings and forgettings in our research, what that might mean for us when we go into an interview setting. Again, I've kind of come up with some kind of conceptual tools here for us to sort of maybe make sense of, or to guide us as we're trying to work with these tensions. I think it has come up a few times, that sort of Eurocentric authority that is intricately bound with academic credentials, our institutional affiliations, where research funding is often emanating from, right? And that's going to create an unequal power relation between the researcher and the participant very often. It's something that's going to shape that relation. We then also, because of presenting ourselves as scholars and researchers, come in with researcher authority, which is very much to do with how we emanate whiteness or become closer to whiteness through being a researcher and being, in a way, an outcome of a long lineage of Enlightenment thinking and racial thinking. But that also means that colonial dynamics continue those lineages in that research authority, in the way that we are expected to be the ones in control of putting the interview schedule together. We are expected to write in our ethical, applications about how we will direct and how we will shape the direction of the research, and how we will use Western Eurocentric concepts to interpret that data, right? So we are being brought into, and we are reproducing, but also we are being socialized into becoming Eurocentric researchers through the very processes of university bureaucracy, yes, and the expectations that are put onto us. And that means that there is not only a potential, but a materiality in terms of how there is a huge distortion being created, yes, and how different truth claims are being legitimized through very Eurocentric academic standards in the ways that, and I will, share this with you, where ideas of surviving racist institutions are deemed from the outset as being a racist claim to make in your research, right? So the institutions will kind of call you biased for saying that you are investigating a racist institution, because how do you know it's racist? You haven't done the research yet, right? So we are in a dynamic here with the institution where we are kind of driving a distortion, a potential distortion in how we're presenting our research. And these things become tricky because supervisor dynamics also have an impact on this, right? So as a researcher committed to racial justice and decoloniality, we are in a constant struggle, right? Interpersonal ones with power, with authority figures in the institution, and also with ourselves, right? As we're trying to unlearn and trying to keep accountable that whiteness within us, yeah? We said a little bit about language, but there's also the academic jargon that creeps into our conversations and interviews, right? We will start using things like racialization. Who's talking about? No one, the everyday person will not use these kinds of language or this kind of description. And so we need to unlearn and sort of bring ourselves accountable to the language and the conceptual tools being used by the communities we're working with, yeah? And to retain those. I'm thinking here actually of Zora Neale Hurston's work, okay, done during the sort of, Harlem Renaissance in the US, where she was doing work with communities where Black communities of some of the last kind of enslaved communities that were still around, and she wanted to work with and capture those stories and write them out using the vernacular rather than sort of Eurocentricizing them and sort of Englishizing them, if you like. So she retained the linguistic practices of those communities and was a huge trailblazer and innovator in that kind of critical ethnography. And also, emotional labor of participants. We have to recognize that the need for rest, silence, withdrawal is very real, and we have to honor that. And it means often that the research may take longer because you need to work in those pauses, those breaks. You need to honor that folks that we're interviewing on these issues, when they are, someone who's experienced racial harm and racial violence, are not talking about, careers. They're talking about a long trauma in an organization. And so that means that we need to understand how what we are studying is embedded in a very long history and a difficult present. And also the politics of leaving as a researcher. We go in, we do our work. You got a timeline, we're being told we better submit our thesis on time. We're going to leave that research context. We can shut the door, we can close the room, we can go, we can write up our notes, we can debrief with our supervisor. But the folks who we are interviewing don't leave that situation, they stay. And I think we need to build in accountability measures, that there is a post-interview as well, right? It's not just an interview, but there is a post-interview as well. Very grateful for the work and the reflections coming out in the chat, and I hope we get to them later on. Can we have the next slide, please? I'm gonna go into slightly uncritical mode now, so forgive me for this. Jan, could we get the next slide? Because I'm gonna go through types of interview. And I want to do this because I think a lot of you may be coming to this session because you are interviewing. You may be harnessing one of these types of interview. You may be thinking, oh, I think I'm doing a mix. And you're very right. You probably very well could be doing a mix, and that's absolutely fine. But I just wanted to go through these types. I promised I would anyway in my blurb about the session. So let's do this. Okay, so we're going to look at semi-structured interviews and ethnographic interviews and unstructured or narrative interviews. I want to do that by kind of presenting them as how we could use these whilst being conscious of being scholars of race, of decoloniality, and also thinking about when we might use these. What are the circumstances and the context in which we might want to use them? So let's start with semi-structured. So this is, I read somewhere, someone said, if you think semi-structured interviews are a bit 2008, here's blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, okay, they're already outmoded. But one of the most popular and well-used, sort of utilized, I should say, interview methods. Jan, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So semi-structured by its nature, what does it mean? It means that you have an interview schedule. However, that interview is flexible. You're not going to sit there and read out each question one by one, and you need to complete that interview schedule. No, within the semi-structured interview, structured flexibility is baked into that method, which means that the participant can also determine the direction of the interview, right? So they can bring in what they believe is relevant, what you've missed, or what they believe the direction of this interview should go in. And as a researcher committed to a semi-structured interview, you will follow that direction. Okay. You may bring it back to some of the things you want to explore in the interview, but you have this flexibility. One way of, I think, building accountability with the folks who we're doing this work with is to co-create interview guides with the community members or your participants. You develop a collective accountability here, something we don't often do, actually. I think this is a really lovely way of also being transparent, right, about what you know and what you're trying to find out, which I think is a really important part of the research process. Many of us offer interview questions beforehand to our participants. I think this is, again, a really good practice to build trust. You're also enabling deeper reflection. You're not there to try to catch someone out. You know, you want to get a, as much, you want to give as much time to your participant as possible to respond to your prompts. And also in semi-structured interviews, there can be, you know, silences. And there can be moments where it feels like it's very awkward, but in a context such as this, where we have flexibility baked into the tool that we're using, we can also think about this as a space for sense making or reflection, right? To not fill in that awkward silence, but actually to use it and reflect on it and maybe come to that as a silence and bring it to the attention of the person you're interviewing, acknowledging it. And then, yes, this is also a very common practice. You allow the participant to ask questions back. This is usually done at the end, isn't it? Do you have any questions? Right? But one way is also to integrate that and to sort of prime the interview space right at the very outset to say, please ask me questions back throughout the interview if you wish. So you're kind of trying to disrupt this kind of one-way power dynamic, which is just you who's the knower, who's able to ask questions, and the participant is just there to kind of give you an insight, which you might use, you might not use. Thank you so much, Jan. Let's go to the next slide. I'll whiz through these relatively quickly because we've got another activity at the end of this little section. So when would you use semi-structured interviews? Well, they're a very taken for granted, very legitimate form of interviewing. It may be that actually within your unit, within your department, there's not much knowledge about forms of interviewing beyond semi-structured interviews. So you need to negotiate those institutional requirements and contexts, but try to build in a decolonial or anti-racist commitment, right? In how you're carrying out this research. You may also be interested in the internal lived experiences, those internal lives of your participants, not so much on those broader cultural or community dimensions, although of course you'll be looking at discourses, right? Of course you may be looking at patterns and themes, but it might be actually that personal, internal lived experience that you want to understand. Semi-structured interviews are often, again, they're quite pre-planned, right? So if you've got a research question and you need to, align your data with that, this is again a method that you use. And lastly, it is quite a formal way of doing interviews. And so thinking about your participants, if they are familiar with interviews, then it is also a good way of blending the way that the interview approach with the participants of your research. Okay, so let's move on then to ethnographic interviewing. Jan, can we have the next slide? Okay, well, ethnography is perhaps most well known for doing field work. What does that mean? It means that the field, the site of study, is where the researcher believes is where meaning is being made. And so you are very interested in doing your interviews as ways to center place-based knowledge. You may do interviews in the field rather than a private room that you've pre-booked somewhere to carry out a semi-structured interview, right? So the ethnographic interview will very often happen, for example, following mothers, doing caring duties, following NGO workers in the field, and you will be interviewing in that field site because you believe that there is something important about locating conversations within the broader community relations context and histories. Another key component of ethnography is reflexivity. So I think Van Manen in '88 sort of brought this to sort of, when qualitative research was having a kind of revival, I suppose, in the US and Europe, talked about reflexivity. Reflexivity was very much brought in by the by ethnographers as a way, just as we did in our activity, to be aware of our own positionality, but not to separate this and not to make this distinction between human and research, but rather to think of these as integral, composites of the same thing, of the same knowledge-making process. So we will return to our own positionality, our own reflexivity in the research, in the interview process. That might be through using a field note diary. So alongside interviewing, you are also documenting your reactions, right? So how Fatima sort of talked about how, gosh, I sort of feel like a bit biased. Keep that bias, record that bias, because you're going to come back to it and keep yourself accountable, right? Later on. So that kind of reflexivity can be built in parallel to doing interviews. It does require a longer time in the field. You are building relations with your participants. You're not there to just go in, do your interview and come back out again. And so you are also potentially returning to conversations, repeat interviews with those participants, with those communities, because you understand that knowledge making is an ongoing process and it is an incomplete process, right? So there is no end to it. So the fluidity and the openness and the iterativeness is built into the way you are interviewing and using interviews. And lastly, I wanted to talk about this idea of the ethnographic refusal. Now, this is an idea where communities choose not to share certain knowledge with the researcher. Now, in a more traditional research setting, the researcher may become anxious, worried, concerned that something is not being shared with them, and there's this vital piece of knowledge that they need to know, and it's not being brought to their attention. But ethnographic refusal is a conceptual tool, a way of making meaning of that silence, which is that It is a way of survival, protecting, livingness, creation, which those communities and that participant is exercising by not giving you access to that knowledge. And another way I like to think about ethnographic refusal is by understanding it as how participants are building registers of trauma that subvert the white gaze through refusing certain knowledge in that research process. And I think that's a very important component of doing research, especially during heightened times of violence and racial violence, where the stakes are very high for folks who are doing this research with you and giving you an interview. Next slide, please. We're going to look at we're going to look at when we use ethnographic interviews, sorry. So you understand that knowledge is not only field contingent, location contingent, you also understand it as being produced in the everyday, the ordinary, right? And because of that, you don't want to take your participant out into a closed room and have a private conversation with them, because you understand that knowledge is being made in the very sort of common everyday occurrences of that person's lived reality. And rather than focusing on individual, internal lived realities, you want to understand how practices, meanings, actions are all produced within a community, within a situated field site. You're going to have a longer time in the field and you're going to return to it to enrich your understanding. You will not at the same time believe that you have complete or full understanding, but rather you are part of a knowledge-making process for a particular time in the field. You may also use ethnographic interviews when you have pre-existing established relationships with that community. You are honoring a long lineage of being part of that community by doing this research and conducting interviews with them. And therefore, it's something that perhaps is more inductive, to use an esoteric term. You believe that your research is going to emerge from the community context, that you are not going in there with a predefined conceptual paradigm that you're going to use to make sense of. No, the knowledge and the sense make is coming from the field, from the community, from the participants themselves. That is what you are honoring to define your conceptualization. Okay, let's go to that last section on types of interview. Just keeping an eye on the time here as well. So the narrative slide, please, the one after that, Jan. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, narrative interviews. Yes, narrative interviews are about honoring, committing to engaging with storytelling, oral knowledge making, orality, spoken word, knowledge that is not written down, that is not esoteric. So your whole research orientation will be around engaging with those community stories and storytelling practices. As such, you can include individual narratives, but also collective narratives and stories. You might want to connect individual stories to community narratives and community histories, for example, through folklore, myths, the sacred as it is understood in that community. And importantly, you will value counter narratives. This is a really important part, I think, of narrative interviews being mobilized in decolonial work, that the community will have narratives of their resistance, stories about their resistance and their reclamation. And and they will, you can use these, you can utilize these, you can honor these by having them as powerful counter hegemonic strategies that these communities are mobilizing. I think also let's talk about a little bit about temporality and narrative, because, you know, with narratives and stories, there is a Eurocentric conception of time about a, you know, a beginning, middle, and an ending, right? And I think when you're working with diverse communities, there will also be diverse understandings of temporality and time, and so stories may not follow the succession, right? The linearity of how Western and Eurocentric tropes of storytelling adhere to. So there may be non-linearity, there may be cyclical understandings of time that are embedded in these narratives, and these could be quite disorientating to conceptions of normative time and history, with a capital H, the Eurocentric telling of history. So these sort of scrambling of time through harnessing narrative can be a really important disruption and intervention in Eurocentric racialized knowledge. And lastly, a method I really like is creating story circles. So thinking about how your narrative interviews don't need to be one-to-one, but you can also invite participants to a story circle, so where the community can collectively narrate an element of their history or their struggle or the events where there's a shared meaning, or maybe not, around certain stories and narratives. Next slide, please. When we may use narrative interviews. So centering the voice of your participants is important, right? You're challenging, you know, the dominant narratives and understandings with these counter narratives. You're interested in linking and looking at relations between individual, collective, and or intergenerational narratives. Your participants might come from communities with very rich storytelling cultures. They may come from communities where orality is an important meaning-making paradigm for them. You will also understand that when doing work on race and decolonizing, that trauma narratives, which are part of this story, and healing narratives, which are also part of the story, are going to emerge over time. They're not, you know, you will need to build accountability with your communities to be given this gift and to be given this story to look after and care for in your research. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. That was my very conventional sort of running through the 3 types of interviews, but I know that it can get a bit listy, so I apologize for that. But you know, sort of coming away from that, I hope that what we've done and what we've shared is a way of understanding that the researcher and the participant are active sites. Active embodied sites where racial meaning is being produced and negotiated. And this comes into how we approach the interview itself. I think it is absolutely fine, brilliant, encouraged for you to mix these different approaches, for you to take and blend approaches, because the discipline gives the impression that there is only one way of doing something. It contains you and it limits your capacity to know different knowledges, to know different knowledge systems. So blending, using different strengths depending on the context and the research that you're doing, the participants and communities you're working with is really important. And I think when entering this, we can ask ourselves, and we can return to these questions around how do my choices about interviewing address community needs? How do they draw on community knowledge systems? How do they uphold the sovereignty of racialized communities? We can keep returning to these questions and asking ourselves this as we're blending, creating, and cultivating our interview practice. Thank you. Yeah, next slide. Okay, this is my second activity that I'm going to invite you to do, and we've only got about 10 minutes left actually, so we can do this even if you like as a kind of broader discussion rather than breakout groups. That might mean you know, it'll take a little bit more time, so I'm sorry that we don't get to do the breakout rooms today. But this activity is really sort of reflecting on what we've gone through today, for us to be given a set of quite traditional interview questions, and for us to invite ourselves to sort of come to these questions and think about, well, what is underlining these questions? Are there some, you know, preconceptions that are underlining the questions here? How might we revise or rewrite them to make them more aligned with a decolonial feminist, Black feminist approach to doing research? So let's look at these research questions, these traditional research interview questions, I should say, not research questions, interview questions. Let's just hang in there with the first one for a while. So in an interview, you could ask, what barriers have you faced in accessing education? What barriers have you faced in accessing education? Have a think, have a moment to think about what is underpinning this question, what assumptions are underpinning these questions which may reproduce